Galen Moomaw, and I am a freshman at Malone University, and I am doing an oral history of my grandpa, Galen Moomaw. And this is for the Com 110 Intro to Communications class. Alright, hey Grandpa.
Hey.
Thanks for making the trip up here. So, we basically just want to do an oral history of your life, and just basically talking about you, so it shouldn't be too hard. So my first question for you is, what was life like growing up in the 30s and 40s?
That's a long time ago. I would say it was much simpler. We were on a farm, and so we did all kinds of farm stuff with taking care of the animals. And I learned early to drive, and so I drove tractors and trucks and cars long before I had a driver's license. So, and we, of course, didn't have television. I can vividly remember the evenings sitting around the big radio we had, and listening to shows like Baby Snooks, who was a girl, and she was an interesting person. And then shows like Fibber McGee and Molly, and you had to use your imagination as you heard all these things. You could imagine the pictures in your mind. And of course, growing up in my growing up years, it was during World War II, and there were programs about the pilots and so on. I was fascinated by one called Hop Harrigan and Tank Tinker, who were a pilot and a mechanic in World War II and all the adventures they had. So had many different things that I can remember. Seeing the first television show, the little store in our little town of Smithville. He had a show window, and he put a television in there, and we go down to Smithville and watch the ball games. So a lot of things have changed.
That's pretty cool. Now, I know that you mentioned that your room was pretty cold and that snow actually came in through the windows, and that you also slept with about 6 blankets. Was that different than times today?
Somewhat, although we still have a cold bedroom, but that was in the north corner of the house. There was no heat in that room, and there must have been a crack in the window, because at times in a snowstorm, the snow would drift in and there'd be a little snowdrift on the windowsill. So in our upstairs of our house, we had one room that was heated, and that was the bathroom. So you'd crawl off from under the covers, make a beeline for the bathroom, and stand next to the radiator.
Yeah, and so there was actually a bathroom in the house, or did you have an outhouse?
Oh, our house was very modern for those days. It had a bathroom upstairs, just the one when I was a kid, but that had running water. In fact, our house was built by my great uncle, and he was quite a wealthy man. He built it for his mother, and it was designed by a Columbus architect. So it had 10-foot high ceilings, and it was the latest in those days. So yes, we always had running water. I know I went to my grandmother's house. They had an outhouse. You had to go out and had this little outhouse with newspapers and so on for toilet paper. And so I experienced what that was, but we were fortunate that we had a very modern house.
What about telephones? Because you probably didn't have cell phones back then.
Oh yeah. Yeah. In fact, we had 2 phones in the house. One was the old crank type. It was the original phone, and it connected to about 6 neighbors, connected all together, a party line. And so you want to call Joe Musser over here, you'd ring 2 longs and 1 short, and they would know that that's their ring and somebody was calling them. But of course, everybody on the line knew that Joe Musser was getting a call, and there would be people on there that they'd listen to see what was going on. And so that was a party line, the very early one. But we also had a dial phone that connected to Smithville and other places. But that was a dial phone early on that you'd lift up the receiver, and a operator would answer and say, "Number, please," and you'd say 567, very simple numbers because there weren't all that many. And in that central office, she would pull up a plug and stick it in a place, and it would ring the person on the other end. So we were quite modern having a dial phone. Oh wait, yeah, that wouldn't have been a dial phone. Might have had that first, and then a dial phone where actually had dialing. Yeah, I can remember dialing coming in. So we've seen many different changes in that.
You also said that one of the early memories was the large radio in the living room.
Okay.
Talk a little about that?
Yeah. that was before television, and so we had these radio programs, and you'd have ones that at 4 o'clock you'd have the 15-minute, what they call a serial program. It's sort of like a soap opera today. I mean, how they go from one to the other. It's a continuous story, and we had those short 15-minute programs. The ones I mentioned for this World War II flyers, Hop Harrigan, Tank Tinker, and they also, I think Superman was in on there, and different ones, and they'd use sound effects so you could visualize what the story was. And in the evening they had other programs, quite often half-hour or hour-long programs, and I remember Sunday afternoon they had mystery programs. Have all creepy sound effects, and you'd hide under the covers and listen to all the ones. I remember one particularly called The Shadow, and he'd always say, "It's the shadow," very dramatically. And so that was your entertainment in those days.
Can you explain or about like one of your favorite episodes, maybe?
Oh boy, I can't remember a favorite episode. But I remember this Baby Snooks was a depiction of a young girl. I'd picture her maybe 10 years old, and she was a very precocious child, and she had a little brother, Roquefort, and Roquefort would speak just garbled, babble like, and Baby Snooks was the only one who could interpret for him. And so he'd babble along, and the parents say, "What did he say? What did he say?" And she'd interpret for him. So she was always getting in trouble and so on. So that was a cute program, and just all kinds of everything from the comedies to the mysteries and so on.
Another memory that I remember you saying having was that a friend of your dad's that you visited pretty often. That was kind of like your idol. Can you,
Okay,
talk about him?
yeah. As a friend of my dad, they go to school together. At least they went to church together. But he was quite a reader. He operated a crane in a steel factory over here in Massillon. But he was interested in electronics. And so when he wasn't busy, he'd be reading books on electronics, which was radio. Started out with radio, and then he got into television. And but he was the one. We would go to his place, and he had a workbench. He repaired people's radios and then later televisions right there in the kitchen, a little small kitchen, but he had a counter with all these tools on it. And I remember he showed me the first television tube. He went to his closet and pulled out this big thing about this long, that big around. It had a picture about this big around. It would have. It wasn't connected even to it. That was just the tube. And that's my first introduction to television. And then when I was about 8th grade, I was starting to get interested in that. So my dad bought a kit through him, a whole box of parts, wires, and so on, and the diagram, how to put it together to make a radio. I put it together, but it didn't work because I didn't know how to solder right, and the connections weren't right. So he went over it and resoldered the connections and adjusted it, and I used that radio for a good many years. So I always appreciated him and his interest in technology and so on, even back, that would have been in the mid-40s.
That's pretty cool. Let's see here. You also said that you found an old car horn and a train transformer. You want to tell us about that? That sounds
Okay.
pretty interesting.
My parents had bought me an electric train set, and it run around, but as part of that, there's a transformer which reduces the voltage from your house voltage down to about 12 volts to run a transformer, and also it's safer than trying to use 110 on the train. But so then I found this old car horn, about so big and long, and actually it was probably a truck horn. And so my bed had a big high back on it. And so I went to the back of that, screwed this car horn on it, hooked up the transformer. It was the right voltage for the same thing as a car had, and then a doorbell button. So when I'd push this button, the car horn would blow back of the bed. And one night I had my friend over and waited till he got to sleep. I reached under this table and pushed the button and blasted this car horn. About scared him out of bed.
Might have had to change the sheets there. Oh. So did you ever do anything mischievous like that, like with your siblings at all? Or?
Yeah, where my room was an upstairs room, and the telephone wire came into the house just below my window. And so I had a pair of headphones that I used with my radio, and so I fixed that up. I made a wire with two little wires, and then I took the insulation off the telephone wire, and I could push it down on there, and I could listen on the telephone. And when she was on talking to her friends, I'd be listening. But when I'd hook up to it, it would crackle. And she said, "Galen, get off the line."
Oh boy. So you just like to aggravate your little sisters, huh?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How many siblings did you have?
Just the one sister, 3 years younger than I.
What did growing up on a farm teach you?
I think, first of all, it taught me to work. We had regular chores. We had things we were expected to do. And then growing up on a farm, I followed my dad's footstep in enjoying mechanics, because we had to fix tractors and so on, and learned a lot from him in the way of mechanics and building things. I'll tell you more about how I went on from that. I learned that. I didn't learn carpentry there, but so that was probably the big thing, being regular at work and taking care of animals and taking care of machinery.
Did you get to drive the tractors at all? Or
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I started driving tractors. My mother told me she was really concerned because I was probably only 6, 7 years old, something like that, when I started driving the tractors. And I can remember we had a sort of like a bulldozer tractor, a tractor, and we had to pull a big, wide, what we call a harrow, to work the ground and take out the weeds. But they hooked it sort of high on the tractor, and as that tractor went through the field, it was sort of like this. It made you feel like you don't come back over, but it didn't. But I can remember just being a little kid riding that. Then also, I was thinking another thing. I used to go barefoot driving the tractor, and in this one we had a cultivator, a corn cultivator, and it was in the days before hydraulics. And so to raise and lower that cultivator, you had to step on a pedal right under the seats. There was actually 2 of them, but these pedals were metal, and they had grooves in them. And in order for me to make that thing trip and raise it, I'd have to almost jump on those pedals, and I was in my bare feet, and I remember that didn't feel so good. I don't know why I didn't wear shoes, but those pedals hurt.
Did you ever have any accidents when driving?
Oh, yeah. My first accident was when I was probably about 12 years old. We grew potatoes, and out in the field, the workers would pile the potatoes on a truck, sort of a flatbed truck, and I would drive this truck up into the barn beside a bin, and then we had an electric hoist. We'd raise this, and potatoes flowed over into a bin. Then I'd have to back the truck out, the empty truck out, before we went to the field. And at that age, I couldn't see back. The truck didn't have mirrors, and so I backed down the barn bank, looking forward to judge where I was. One day, as I backed down, I heard a crunch, and I stopped and pulled it back up into the barn. And then I saw somebody parked their car on the barn bank. So I went to my dad, told him. I don't remember anything negative happening for that, but that was my first accident.
Wow. Excuse me. So, I know you talked a little about World War II. Did your dad or your grandpa mention any effects?
During World War II, farmers were exempt from the draft, and so being on the farm, you didn't have to go to service. And so I know one of my cousins wanted to avoid the draft, and so he hired on with us, particularly so he wouldn't have to go to the war. But the war years were very good years, because there was demand for all the crops we could grow, and so it was a very profitable time. That was coming out of the Depression, which were very hard times. And then the World War II caused great prosperity among people, but the other effect was that many things were rationed. Every car had you'd apply for a sticker on your car, an A, B, or C, according to what priority you had, and that would tell you how many gallons per month you could buy, how many gallons of gasoline per month you could buy. And farmers had it good. They had an extra allocation of gasoline, and every now and then the car would get pulled up to the farm tank and filled. But so the war years were good years for the farmers.
You said that gas was rationed. Was anything else that
Oh yeah, many things were rationed. Because you see, they were pouring everything they had into production for the army and so on, and also, I guess, for helping other countries. And so gasoline was very scarce. Tires were scarce. You had, if your tire blew out and you didn't have the proper coupon to get another, and you just stuck. And sugar was rationed. And so you could only have so much sugar. And I think there was maybe meat rationing, but that didn't bother you on the farm. But many things were rationed because everything was being poured into what they call the war effort. And they encouraged people to buy saving stamps. You could buy stamps for, I don't know, 10 cents to $1. You get so much, then you get a savings bond that paid interest. And so they had big campaigns to get people to buy these savings stamps, savings bonds that provided extra money for the war effort. So yeah, it was, and the other thing was sugar. As I said, sugar was rationed. At the end of the war, sugar rationing continued for a while. But then my dad liked to travel, and so a year or so after the end of the war, but right at the end of the war, we actually got a mobile home and traveled to Texas and lived down there for 6 weeks. And while we were there, we could drive a few miles, take a little motorboat across the Rio Grande River into a little town, and every person that went over could bring back 5 kilos of sugar. That's a little over 5 pounds someplace. But we would make repeated trips over there and bring back our 5 kilos. And so when we come back home, we had quite a supply of sugar. So that was one effect of sugar rationing.
Nice. What about, where were you when the end of the war was announced? Do you remember that at all?
Yeah, I definitely remember that. I was in grade school, 5th grade, I think. But in the school, only one room had a radio. And so they gathered, I guess about the whole school in this big classroom. And I remember President Roosevelt, or it might have been President Truman at that time, announcing the end of the war. And that was a great thing. Now, I don't remember whether that was the end of the war in Europe. See, there was 2 endings. There was the war in Europe against Germany, and that had an ending. And then it was some months later that the end of the war with Japan occurred. So I don't remember which of those was, but I specifically remember hearing the president announce the end of the war.
So when the war was actually ended then, do you remember any specific impacts or changes that your family made?
No, I can't remember anything specific about it because we weren't greatly impacted by the war. I mean, because there was great demand for farming products, and so I don't remember any big changes at the end of the war, except cars became available. See, all during the war, they didn't make you couldn't buy a car. Everything they produced was used for the war. And so before the war, my dad liked to trade his car every year. Every year he'd get a new car, and a car at that time might only cost $1,000. And so he could afford to trade every year. Well, during the war he couldn't trade. And so at the end of the war, they started making cars again, and you had to put your name on a list, and it'd be 6 months to a year you could get a car. And so the Ford and Chevrolet were the major manufacturers, but a guy came along, Henry Kaiser, who had been building warships, started making cars, but they were not well made. But my dad wanted a car so bad, he bought a Fraser that was an upscale of that line. He bought a Fraser, but then when he went to trade it back, nobody wanted to trade it back.
I remember you also mentioned about a Navajo reservation. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Okay. When I got to the age of about 18 or 19, at that time they had still had the draft where you had to go into service of some kind. And so I saw that I was going to have to go into service, but at that time there was no war going on. There really wasn't need for military service. And we had grown up in a church where the strong teaching of pacifism or not being involved in the military. And many of the young men would opt out as conscientious objectors, conscientiously objecting to the war. And the government allowed them to serve in other ways. Some served in hospitals. In fact, Jackie's husband, Steve, his dad served as a medic on the field. He could do that because he wasn't carrying arms. And so they had provision for what you called the conscientious objector. Well, it came to my time, and I would be called up to serve. And so knowing these things and my background with that pacifist teaching, I found out that our Navajo mission could use conscientious objectors to serve there in place of the military. So partially from religious conviction and partially from practicality, I thought, well, there's no war going on. They don't really need me there, and I could do something that's profitable in another way. So I made arrangements to serve on this Navajo mission, and so I served for 2 years, and I worked on this Navajo mission. I did maintenance work and helped with the kids in the school and just did all kinds of things for 2 years. It was quite an experience.
Was it kind of lonely being away from your family? Or?
Oh yeah, very definitely so. When I went out there, my place to live was a little house trailer, probably a little bigger than this room. I was all by myself, off from another larger building. This larger building held a dormitory for the girls and a kitchen, and a lady cooked for the school children, and so she cooked for me. And so in the evenings I was all alone, and so I wanted to write home, and somewhere I came across a typewriter. I thought I had to learn to type, so I went to town and I bought a $1.25 typing course, and went about half through it till I could figure out how to do it. And so I wrote my letters home on a typewriter. But then, let's see, it was the first year. But anyway, there's another young couple were there, a young married couple, and they invited me into their home, and we spent a lot of evenings, learned to play chess, and we did a lot of fun things.
What about Lola? That was a pretty interesting story.
Okay. Lola was a mother of a family that lived a few miles from our mission. I would judge her at that time, it might have been in her 30s to 40s, because she had relatively young children. And they lived up on high in what you call a mesa. A mesa was straight up the sides, flat on top, and they lived up on this mesa a mile or so from the mission. And one day I got word that Lola was sick and needed to be taken to the hospital. So my job was usually sort of the loose man. I'd drive, and so we started off for this Crown Point Hospital, which meant about 50 miles on dirt roads way back in the boonies to take her to this hospital. And it was rainy and wet that day, and I managed to find my way and delivered her to this hospital and come back. That Jeep, the Jeep station wagon, the only place you could see anything that wasn't mud was where the windshield wipers had worked. But I took her there and got back home. Some weeks later, our mission director came to me mid to late afternoon, and he says, Lola died, and you're supposed to go get her body. And I says, where? He says, I don't know. But he said, you take the station wagon, and by the way, he says, maybe you better take some blankets along. I didn't know what he was talking about. So I took off, and I says, well, how will I find where her body is? Well, he says, you go down to Cuba, this little town about the size of Smithville, and he says there's a state policeman posted there, and I had met him on other occasions, not professionally, but I knew who he was, and we had met. And so it was getting along toward dark. I went down and I found him, and on his radio he called and he said, well, she's in Las Vegas, New Mexico. Las Vegas was about 70 miles down to Albuquerque, 100 miles up to Santa Fe, 100 miles out to Las Vegas. And so I started off, and I went part way and stayed overnight. And next morning I started out, and on the way I had a flat tire. And he hadn't sent me much of any extra money. I certainly didn't have money for a tire. So I made it to Las Vegas, and I knew that she was at a certain funeral home, so I asked at the restaurant where I got breakfast, says, where do I find this funeral home? Well, it's down the street here. So I went to the funeral home, and I said, oh, by the way, I don't have any spare tire. He says, well, you can't go back 200 miles plus without a spare tire. He says, I got a friend who works at the filling station, so for $5, I got a used tire, put it on. So we went back to the funeral home and went into one of the back rooms, and there on the table was a body. And that's why he sent the blankets along, because we put a blanket on the floor. I picked up the feet. He picked up the head. His body was stiff as a board. Put it down on there, wrapped her up, shoved her in the station wagon, covered her up, and I took off for home, me and the body. So got home, and while I was gone, the family had gone to the trading post and bought all new clothes for her, new jewelry. And this friend of mine who worked at the mission had built a wood box for a casket, and they fixed her up to put her in that casket. And one of the traditions of the Navajo is they don't want anything to do with a dead body. In fact, often they would bring a very sick person to our mission station and leave, so that the person would die on our hands, not on their hands. And so we had a little plot of ground out back where they have a cemetery. So they buried Lola in the cemetery, and so that was my story of Lola.
Wow. Do you have any other memories from just like, growing up in those early years, or that you'd like to share?
Not really. Of course, being in the church was a very important thing. When I was about 8th grade, we were attending a church, and my mother began to sense that they weren't teaching the Word. And she had gone to a Bible class and had learned more, and so she compared what was being taught in our church and what she learned from the Bible. She saw that our church was not teaching the Bible, and so she was particularly the instrumental one in looking around, and we found what is our church now, the Brethren Church. And so she and my dad together decided that we would leave this church where my dad had gone all his life to this new church. And I can remember being an 8th grader, going to the youth meetings, and the very wonderful times we had in these youth meetings, and then growing up there in that church. And so we're still there. And I say one of my greatest joys is to be walking down the hallway of the church and hear a small voice behind me say, "Hi, Grandpa." That means that our children have taught their children. Our grandchildren are now growing in the Lord. So it was a wonderful thing that my mother had the courage to step out and learn what it meant to be a real Bible teaching church, and took us children to that. So it's made a tremendous difference. I saw friends of mine who continued on in that church, and many numbers of them were not close to the Lord. They didn't have the Bible teaching that we had the advantage of having.
I know a family friend from church, Ruth Knight, that she was kind of influential in you meeting my grandma.
Okay,
a little bit?
Yeah. When I come back from New Mexico, I was, of course, single and unattached, and at the same time, Evie had gone to work for a factory in Orville, and a lady in our church knew Evie from work. She knew me from the church. And so she acted as a go-between. And so one evening, the Knight family says, "Come down to our place. We have somebody for you to meet." And so they said the same thing to Evie. So here was Evie. And the husband was a coach, I think. Somehow he had access to the school trampoline. So we met on a trampoline. And that was we've had our ups and downs ever since.
Ups and downs, no pun intended.
Oh, to follow that story through, the Knights have a son by the name of Steve. And our son and Randy, your dad, Steve and Randy got together, and for 25 years now they have led Bible school. They do the music and skits and all kinds of crazy stuff, but our families are still traveling together in that way.
Did Grandma or Evie do any work on the farm then after you guys got married?
Yeah, my dad and I worked together till how old would the kids have been, Ev? They were pretty young yet.
Yeah, in grade school.
Yeah, we worked together till my father, riding his motorcycle, was killed instantly. And I can remember that day. We had a couple young fellows working for us, and Evie cooked for them, and we were all around the table, and here came a police car in the lane. And I looked closer, and I saw my mother was in the car. And so come out, and the policeman from Worcester, my father had been killed. Somebody went left to center and killed him instantly. And so this policeman picked up my mother, brought her to our place to give her the word that my dad was killed. So with my dad gone, we needed another person. So Evie stepped in and learned to drive a tractor, and she spent many days, for a good many years, she did all the plowing with this big tractor with a 3-bottom plow, 3 or how many was it, 4 bottom plow. And in fact, in the early days, the kids would come home from school and ride with her in the tractor. Emmy particularly rode in that tractor often, in that tractor with a cab on. And then in the fall, when we graded the potatoes, Evie would ride on this machine and grade the potatoes there, and then we'd take them into storage. And then during the winter time, she would grade the potatoes as we packed them or sent them out on semis. So she, for many years there, she worked almost full time on the farm.
Wow. Was this normal for like a lady to be working on the farm?
Yeah, many ladies did, particularly when they had dairy farmers. The ladies would help to milk. They'd take care of the calves, and so in the early days, it was very normal. In fact, it's still quite a normal thing for her wives to help on the farm in various ways.
All right. Well, thank you. And I know, kind of a change of subject, that you're a pretty talented musician. Do you want to tell us how that came about?
It came about because my parents forced me to. Started out, I was probably 3rd grade. They had a lady who would come to our house every week and give music lessons to me and to my sister. And so I played piano. And long about 8th grade, I got a little tired of it and wanted to quit. My dad says, no, when I was a kid, my parents gave me piano lessons and I talked them out of it. And he said, I'm not making the same mistake on you. So I took piano lessons up through high school. And then about the 8th grade, we went to a program where there was a group who played accordions came in. It was actually down in the Kidron Livestock Auction building. And these people from Bern, Indiana come in and played their accordions. And I said, I'd like to learn to play one of those. So my dad got me one and found a teacher. And so I played accordion for a good many years. I play it for youth activities and even played it occasionally at our national youth conference. And so that was, and then after I'd been to New Mexico, I come back and I thought, I'd like to learn to play the organ. So I found a teacher in a large church that had a big organ, and he taught me organ, and then I went on to play the organ some at church, but then even more when the pastor's wife was the organist, got sick, and so I played continually for a number of years till another lady came along and was better than I was, so I stepped aside and let somebody else do it.
That's awesome. So besides music, I know you also have an interest in computers. Did that come about the same way? Were you forced into it, or did you like that all along?
When I saw the first computers come out, I thought, boy, I'd like to get one. So I found an excuse to get one, and after I had it, it was an early one, not the very earliest, but it was a Radio Shack TRS-80, what they call the Trash 80, but that had no hard drive, or not even a disk drive. You had to record the information on a cassette tape. And I remember a guy coming along, he was also interested in it. He says, they got this new thing. It's called a hard drive. It holds 5 megabytes, not 5 gigabytes, 5 megabytes. And it only costs $4,000. You got to get one. But I didn't right away. But so I eventually programmed our farm accounting business on it. And then our good friend was the accountant at the church. And I saw what she was doing and how labor intensive that was. And I thought, I bet you I could use my farm program for that. And so I worked with her. She was very patient, and she would enter the information. And I developed a program for the church for accounting and database. And then that took me into where they asked me to come into the church and work. And so that was a whole nother side of life.
So you actually kind of like made the database for our church.
Yeah, the first database for the church, a list of people's names. I had ladies help me, and I'd take the lists they had, and they'd type them into the computer. And then we got to a place where we could print labels for mailings and in fact, we got to the point where we were keeping Sunday school records and so on. And I developed those programs. which was quite an interesting experience. And Evie can testify that I spent my evenings working on, I'd say, I need to do this with the program, and so I developed something new.
Did this job take the place of farming, or did you do both?
To some extent, it was at the time your dad and Tim had finished college and they were coming back on the farm. So during that period of time, I gradually transitioned to nearly full-time at the church. And while Tim and Randy operated most of the time on the farm, I'd come home when they were busy and so on. But it did make a change there. So for 18 years, I worked nearly full-time at the church.
Did you have any college experience for this, or you just...
No, my only post-high school training was several of us would come up to Akron. There was an Akron Bible Institute, and I took a few classes at Akron Bible Institute. I wanted to go to college. In fact, the summer after I was in high school, I planned to go to Wheaton College. And in that summer, my grandfather suddenly died. My dad turned to me and says, well, if you want to farm, now's the time. So that was the end of my college hopes. But then it was after that, then, because of the draft, I was forced to be away for 2 years, and when I went to the Navajo mission. So, no, I've had very little, just those couple classes of college.
Wow. So, from growing up, did you learn anything that you put into practice when raising my dad and Uncle Tim and Aunt Jackie?
Yeah, probably one thing, we had the potato storage, fairly big building, and when they were looking for something to do, go sweep the potato storage. And we'd pay them for it, of course. They earned money. And then the ability to work and see work, we got into potato bagging, and where we bagged the potatoes in small bags for grocery stores. And we started out small, and we did it on Saturday mornings with the kids helping. And your dad hated that with a passion. He would be so grumpy out there working on it because it was cold and it was Saturday morning. And so instead of being home watching television, they had to work on this stuff. And so we had that. And so it was good training. And I think they'll say that today. But we, of course, paid them, and they saved their money and were able to buy a motorcycle with that. So that made it worthwhile. So that was the one thing I think we passed on. Any comments, any thoughts for you? You were very much involved in that.
I didn't like the motorcycle so much. Because one day your dad was coming down to lunch, and all of a sudden he wasn't in the field anymore. He hit a hole with the motorcycle, and he just disappeared. Why? So his head come creeping up. He was okay, but it was kind of scary.
So I guess they were kind of mischievous kids, huh?
Oh yeah. We had my nephew working for us one summer, and they all had motorcycles. And so Tim and Randy snuck over there one time, and they put a wire from the spark plug up to the hand grip. So as soon as he started his motorcycle, he would get shocked. And then another time they went over there, took his motorcycle all apart, and hung it on the telephone poles out along the lane. So they were busy.
Oh my. I know another one of your hobbies was building planes.
Hmm.
How did that kind of come about, and how is it still here today?
Ever since your dad and Tim were little, Sunday afternoons we would ride our bikes to a neighbor's place just at the end of our farm, where these guys had an airfield, and they would fly model airplanes. And so we'd go over there and watch them. And in the back of my mind, I thought, that's something I'd like to do someday. So when the boys got older, I went to the fellow who was the head of the club, and I says, I'd like to learn how to fly these. So he found me a used plane, and I learned to fly it. And so I've been tinkering around with airplanes ever since.
That's awesome. So I guess let's see here. How old are you now?
78.
Wow, you picked up a lot of experiences in your life.
The Lord's been good. He's given me many experiences, and we've had a very good life. We've had the opportunity to see our kids grow up and be successful. When I term successful, not necessarily monetary successful, but they've raised good families. They're responsible. They take care of themselves and others. I see other families where they have not taught their children well. Their children are not responsible. They don't take care of themselves, let alone anybody else. So our greatest joy is seeing our children grow up and be able to function and give of themselves to others, to not only their children, but others in the community. And so these have been our greatest joys.
Well, thank you for your time and all of your insight and wonderful stories. And yeah, thanks for talking with us.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. Hope you get better than a B- on this.